Hello, and welcome to Critical Weight Theory and my little show within a show that I call Reply To, which is just me responding to YouTube comments. Now, I do have a little bit of a cold here still, so I'm going to be even lower energy than normal, and I'm not that energetic of a person to begin with, so I apologize for that. And all right, let's get to the comment here. So, a person wrote, okay, so you're saying that Obamacare was legal, which it is, because it went through the normal election courts and lawmaking procedures. You just destroyed the entire argument in the comments below by saying deportations are illegal. The reasoning is everything President Trump is doing went through elections, the Congress, the courts, and the lawmaking processes. If a Obamacare is legal, then the deportation is currently going on are completely legal because they went through the exact same process. Now you might not like deportations or whoever made that comment, but they are legal. And that's the end of that comment. So I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack for the grammar errors because maybe English is not their first language. I don't know that. Um, and I'm being a little bit more polite than they would probably be to me. If I was butchering sentences and, not making my points 100% clear, I'm pretty sure a lot of right wingers would go after me for, the flaws that are on display here. But I'm going to be generous like a stereotypical liberal, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume maybe English is not their first language. So, what about that argument? Well, it falls apart for a few basic reasons. First, I never said all deportations under Trump were illegal. That's a straw man. What I said is that some deportations and deportation practices have been illegal, which is objectively true and well documented. Courts blocked multiple Trump deportation policies precisely because they violated existing law and or constitutional protections. Saying some deportations were illegal is not the same as saying deportation itself is illegal. And second, the comparison to Obamacare is flawed. Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, is a statute. It went through Congress, was signed by the president, and survived repeated court challenges, including Supreme Court review. Its legality comes from the fact that the law itself was passed according to constitutional procedures and upheld by the courts. Deportations are not a single law passed by Congress in the same way. They are executive actions carried out under immigration law, and each policy, rule, or enforcement method still has to comply with existing statutes, due process requirements, administrative law, and court rulings. So, if it doesn't do that, then you can question its legality. And winning an election does not automatically make every action a president takes legal. Congress passing immigration laws does not mean every deportation carried out under them is lawful. Legality depends on how the policy is implemented. Third, courts repeatedly ruled that specific Trump deportation policies were illegal. So, examples include attempts to end DACA without proper procedure, family separation without legal justification, fast track removals that deny due process, and deportations carried out in defiance of court orders. And you could also make a solid argument that a lot of the policies that are being implemented are cruel and unusual, and that they violate some human rights and they attack innocent people. Like, just the past few days, I learned that they deported a 2-month old who had chronic bronchitis. And I'm not sure how that could be deemed a legal thing to do because obviously a child of that young age, they're not going to be able to fend for themselves. So that strikes me as cruel and unusual. And it's certainly not being done to protect children. And you can't say that that child was a terrorist or that infant or whatever. We're talking 2 months old. And there have been other children who've been deportated, who have been deported. So I'm going to blame my cold for stumbling with my words a little bit here. Um, but anyway, if deportations were automatically legal simply because Trump was elected, courts wouldn't have blocked or overturned various actions, but they did. Finally, you don't like it is not a legal argument. People challenged certain deportations not because they merely dislike immigration enforcement, but because the government violated the law while enforcing it. That's how the legal system works. Courts don't rule simply based on feelings, they rule based on statutes, precedent, and constitutional limits. So the reality is simple here. Obamacare is legal because the law itself was properly enacted and upheld. Deportation as a concept is legal, and some Trump era deportation policies and actions were illegal and still are, which is why courts stopped them, and in some cases will likely stop some of them in the future. That doesn't destroy the argument, it is the argument. So, of course, there are other dimensions you could add to this beyond legality. You could argue the ethics of deportations. You could question the nature of our government that goes around stomping other countries without respecting their borders. How come our government is able to stomp around the globe and attack other countries, bomb them? How come we're able to support dictatorships, fund terrorist groups, and all that kind of stuff without any sort of restrictions? Somehow the only threats that we're supposed to be concerned about are a lot of immigrants who travel around just looking for jobs and stuff. Like they're the only terrorists. They're the only threat. Well, we know that the United States government is hypocritical. It always has been, and it always wants to portray foreigners as the biggest threat, when in fact our government is actually the biggest threat on the planet. Because, like right now, we're imposing these inhuman restrictions on Cuba. We're having this cruel embargo on them so they can't get any fuel into their country. It's basically an illegal siege, you know, uh, and we're just preventing Cuba from having basic access to resources that you would have with actual free trade. So that's just another example, of the United States actually being a bigger threat than these wicked immigrants or whatever. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of Republicans just will not open their eyes and see that the biggest threat is actually coming from inside the house, so to speak, when it comes to human safety and human dignity. And somebody merely wanting to travel to a different place is not inherently a threat. I think that if we had sane immigration policy, people would be able to travel pretty freely, not just to the United States, but pretty much anywhere in the world, and they would feel safe to do so, and it would be an easy process, and you could have all sorts of, citizenships to different parts of the world. That would be, in my view, a good idea. I'd like to be able to travel freely around the world, and I see nothing inherently wrong with that. And if there is like a proverbial worst of the worst Ted Bundy type, well, then you could still go after them, and it would potentially even be easier if you have international cooperation and you actually, take such threats seriously and go after any cases like that. Instead, we're making these psychopaths our leaders and refusing to hold them accountable for when they commit crimes. So, right now, as we're supposedly grappling with all these uh, evil immigrants and whatnot, the Trump administration is actually protecting the Jeffrey Epstein style billionaires out there who are, in many cases, closely tied to people like Jeffrey Epstein. And in some countries, like they're actually holding some of these types of people accountable. In the United States, we're going in the complete opposite direction, and it's all just to blame immigrants instead. Like that's the propaganda technique that is being employed at this time. And thankfully, some people are starting to see through it who might not have seen through it before, because the cover up of Trump's ties to Epstein are just, it's just so obvious at this point, that cover up. And as the scandals pile up here, we see that Trump is threatening Greenland and Canada and Mexico and all these different countries. Well, that's not immigrants outside of America threatening people around the globe. That's the president who's threatening other people. You know, so it's not like there are no violent criminals who travel around the world, but a lot of them happen to be millionaires and billionaires, and they can afford to freely travel around. And, that's kind of how the immigration system is designed. If you have money, if you have connections, well, you can travel anywhere you want. But I said anywhere kind of weirdly there. But you can travel anywhere you want if you've got the money and the connections. But if you're one of those poor people who might be a refugee escaping a war or some sort of extreme poverty, well, you're going to have to be struggling alone because you're not one of the privileged few who can basically buy their way out of a problem. And that's unfortunately how so much of this works. It's who you know and how much money you've got. And it's not about actual principles of safety or national security or anything like that. If if you don't have the cash, you're just going to be out on your own. You're going to be out in the cold, and that's the nature of the system.